Good morning. My name is Rashida Butler, and I'm the president of the Black Law Students Association. Welcome to Race in the Law Forum, and I'm happy to see all y'all faces here, especially with the snowy roads. This year's forum is about a monopoly on getting out of jail, bail to jail reform. We are here to learn from our speakers and panelists and exchange ideas. We are here to learn about an issue that has disproportionately affected minorities everywhere, not just Vermont, not just down south, but everywhere in the United States. With that said, I hope that you all leave here today empowered. Make today and this forum your change. Your charge to change policy, to challenge institutional ideals, and to change the world we live in. This is a place to do it. This is a day to respect other people's ideals and come together as one, learn from one another, respect one another, and have a good time. And it is my pleasure to introduce a wonderful dean. He's amazing. He's our newest dean. He came here over the summer. I had a chance to meet him over the summer as a student ambassador. His name is Dean McHenry. He is an outdoorsy person, and he likes to take long walks to the gym. So without further ado, Dean McHenry.
Morning, everybody. Rashida, thank you very much. Those are incredibly nice things to say, and we'll have to make sure that there's some money in your mailbox later in the day. I really appreciate that. That's very sweet of you. It's a treat to be up here, and thank you to the Black Law Student Association for inviting me to speak today. I feel humbled by the invitation because there are a lot of people, and I'm looking out in the audience here, at Professors Brennan and Hoffman and Will Banks and Sands and Barry and who I'm missing, and Farrier and Nolan, who actually would be much more articulate on this subject. So I'll just offer a few thoughts and then turn it over to your distinguished group of speakers today. And one of them is right here from the ACLU, and I got a chance to meet him and find out about what's going on in Vermont with the ACLU. You also have TJ Donovan coming. I know, Rashida, you spent a little time with TJ, and I think it's terrific. He's the senior law enforcement officer in the state of Vermont, and so it's a treat to have him here at the school today, too, and that'll be our lunchtime speaker. And I think a lot of you, just got a show of hands, how many people in the room attended the Martin Luther King Day presentation? So almost everybody. So you heard Professor Solow speak at that point, and her thoughtful presentation touched on many of the issues that we'll be talking about today. So I just have a few comments. I want to start off by, on a very positive note, by highlighting the commitment that Vermont Law School makes to diversity. About 20% of our student body are students of color, and I think you already know that that's a much larger percentage than you will find elsewhere in Vermont, unless you went over the border, maybe on the Dartmouth campus or up to Burlington. And also, it's a much larger percentage that you'd find in the ranks of the senior management of America's corporations and in America's large law firms, from which I came, where we are sadly lacking in addressing the deficiencies in terms of racial representation. I like to think that we have an immensely inclusive and supportive and welcoming community here at Vermont Law School. I know that that brings, as Rashida said, great richness to our community. And I wonder, as the dean of a law school, how we can do more to promote diversity. And I have the sense that our small size as a school and our small size as a town, we are apparently the only accredited law school in the United States without a stoplight in our town. And the close quarters in which we study and work and live don't help us. They assist us in promoting diversity and a sense of inclusiveness. And I think that's one of the special things about Vermont Law School. I have 2 kids who are in their 20s, mid-20s, and I'm so impressed by this generation's not only commitment to diversity, but its absolute acceptance and insistence upon diversity, not just racial diversity and ethnic diversity, diversity in sexuality and other areas. Maybe the one area where we could do more, and that I would encourage you to do more for the younger people in the room and the older people in the room, is our diversity and acceptance of differing political points of view. And that's something we can also work on. So let me mention a few things about Vermont and Vermont's contribution to diversity, which you may not know, which I've always think something we can be proud of. The Vermont Constitution was the first constitution in the United States of America to allow for universal suffrage without property qualifications. However, it was universal male suffrage, not universal suffrage. But Vermont was the first constitution, state constitution in the United States to outlaw slavery. And in the brutal and bloody Civil War that pitted brother against brother and father against son, and the war in which more Americans died than all other American wars from the Revolution through today's battles in Iraq and Afghanistan, more people died in the Civil War. On a per capita basis, more soldiers came from Vermont than any other state. So Vermont contributed more, both in terms of soldiers and apparently in terms of deaths on a per capita basis than any other state. So I think that's something we can be proud of in Vermont. I wanted to mention a book that I read recently called The Color of Law. And some of you may have heard Professor Kathleen Falk, when she was here this fall, talk a little bit about this book by Richard Rothstein. I can't claim to have read the book really in great detail, but I did find when I was preparing these remarks a couple of things that I thought were absolutely fascinating. The book is a history of housing discrimination in the United States. And Rashida, I think it speaks exactly to some of the issues you're going to pick up about bail and the criminal justice system that we're going to hear about from some of our speakers. But let me just read a couple of things that Professor Rothstein talks about that I think relate to this same issue and then relate to the role of law. These are points that are made in this book. If you ever want to look, it's on pages 180 and 181. First of all, that someone's parents' economic status is commonly replicated in the next generation. So once government prevented African Americans from fully participating in the mid-20th century free labor market, depressed incomes became, for many, a multi-generational trait. The value of white working and middle-class families' suburban housing appreciated substantially over the years. And you know that if you've known people who have had suburban housing and just seen the rise in prices. It's been particularly true in a state like California, where we've seen extraordinary increases in the value of residential real estate. This resulted in vast wealth differences between whites and blacks that helped define permanently our racial living arrangements. Because parents typically bequeath their assets to their children, the racial wealth gap is even more persistent down through generations than income differences. And that's not something I ever really thought about because, of course, wealth concentration can be so important. We waited as a society, this is Rothstein speaking, we waited as a society too long to try to undo it. By the time the labor market discrimination abated sufficiently for a substantial number of African Americans to reach the middle class, and that would have been as a result of some of the developments in the law with the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and afterwards. Homes outside urban black neighborhoods had mostly become unaffordable for working and lower middle class families. And you know about that, you see some of these phenomena in Vermont too. Once segregation was established, seemingly race-neutral policies reinforced it to make remedies even more difficult. Perhaps the most pernicious has been the federal tax code's mortgage interest deduction, a subject of some debate in the recent tax controversies, which increased the subsidies to higher income suburban homeowners while providing no corresponding tax benefit to renters. And you can take Professor Wilbank's tax class and learn more about this. Because de jure, which is of course the Latin word for law, policies of segregation ensured that whites would be more likely to be owners and African Americans more likely to be renters, the tax code contributes to making African Americans and whites less equal despite the code's purported non-racial provisions. Finally, contemporary federal, state, and local programs have reinforced residential segregation rather than diminished it. Federal subsidies for low-income family housing have been used mainly to support those families' ability to rent apartments in minority areas where economic opportunity is scarce and not in integrated neighborhoods. Likewise, developers of low-income housing have used federal tax credits mostly to construct apartments in already segregated neighborhoods. Even a half century after government ceased to promote segregation explicitly, it continues to promote it implicitly, every year making remedial action more difficult. That was a fascinating analysis of how housing policies have contributed to the segregation of our society. And I live in the town of Norwich, Vermont, and if you follow the listserv or the Valley News, you know how controversial affordable housing is, even in a small town like Vermont. So these are very much issues that stay with us. I want to end by sharing a quote that a federal district judge I clerked for, and who I greatly admired. He was very much a civil rights lawyer before he joined the bench. He used to quote a French philosopher named Anatole France. She was French and her name was France. And she said, she gave this quote, and the first time he mentioned it to me, I didn't quite follow it, but I think I do, and I think Rashida and group it applies a little bit what we're talking about today. The quote was that the law, in its infinite majesty, allows the rich and the poor to sleep under the bridges of Paris. Now, what did she mean? What she meant by this expression was that the law defines behavior in a supposedly egalitarian way, right? Equal protection, let everybody do it. But the difference is that if you're poor, you have to sleep under the bridges of Paris, and if you're rich, you don't. So the question is, how can law achieve social justice, but at the same time be fair? And I think that's one of the questions you're probably going to talk about today. So I hope you have a very provoking set of conversations, and I look forward to participating in part of it. I have some other meetings, but I'll be here for part of it. And enjoy yourselves and have a great day. Thank you, Rashida.
Hey, good morning, everybody. And once again, thank you for coming. As many of you already know, and most of you probably know, ever since the ACLU's inception, they've always been at the forefront for fighting for the civil rights and the constitutional rights of the everyday citizen. Our today's speaker is the newest director of the ACLU. He joined the Vermont ACLU last year, coming from Arizona. James Lyle is a New England native, and he's a graduate of Middlebury College. When he finished Middlebury College, he was a law fellow for the Immigrants' Rights Project in Los Angeles, where he provided legal assistance and representation to those who were detained and to unaccompanied immigrant children who were facing deportation proceedings. After his work there, he spent a good deal of time, about 5 years, as a member of the Arizona ACLU, where he opened the first satellite office in Tucson. And after his stint there, he joined the Vermont ACLU as its newest executive director. And today, he will be speaking about the ACLU of Vermont's newly launched criminal reform program. So new that, I don't even think they put it online yet. I think it was just announced maybe last week or so, very recent. And as part of that, bail reform is an essential part of that component. So it's my pleasure to welcome James Lyle to Vermont Law School.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kyron. I really want to thank everybody for inviting me here. I want to thank Vermont Law School and the Black Law Students Association. This is my first visit to Vermont Law School for a Vermont Law School event. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. So I'm gonna I'm going to frame my remarks in the context of the ACLU's campaign for smart justice, which, as Kyra mentioned, we launched just last week. And I think in the course of sort of describing that campaign and why we feel it is necessary and timely, I'll touch upon a number of aspects of that campaign, including bail and other aspects of the criminal justice system that relate to bail and to racial justice in Vermont and in this country. And I'm also going to try not to speak for too long because I would like to leave as much time as possible for discussion and for your questions. For anybody who's not familiar with the ACLU, at least locally, we are the local affiliate, the Vermont affiliate of the national ACLU, one of 54 state affiliates in the states, DC and Puerto Rico. We are a nonpartisan advocacy organization engaged in impact litigation, strategic policy advocacy, community organizing, and public education to advance and defend the Bill of Rights and constitutional rights for all Vermonters. We have 8,000 members. Our membership has quadrupled in size in the last year. I don't know why, but it just happened. So here we are. Again, I want to talk about the campaign for smart justice, just a brief introduction to that campaign and then some of the specific components of it. The National ACLU launched the campaign for smart justice a few years ago with the stated goal of cutting the national prison population in half and eliminating the gross racial disparities that pervade that system nationwide. The United States is the world's leading jailer. We incarcerate 2.3 million people currently. And again, racial disparities are endemic and run through that entire system in all states, including here in Vermont. So just last week, the ACLU of Vermont launched Smart Justice Vermont, which is the local version of this national campaign. We have the same goal of cutting Vermont's prison population, which is currently about 1,700 people, cutting that number in half, and eliminating the racial disparities that also pervade that system. Vermont incarcerates Black men, for example, at a higher rate than any other state in the country. So we have the same goals as our colleagues at the National ACLU, and we are working closely with them and criminal law reform experts around the country to achieve that goal. And I think we have a good chance of being the first state to pull it off, frankly. Vermont is already seeing its prison population decline in recent years, in part due to some important reforms championed by everyone from grassroots leaders and individuals at the local level on up to elected leaders in the State House, the Attorney General, and the governor, who's signed some important legislation in recent years, Governor Scott and his predecessor. So Vermont is headed in the right direction. We have a lot going for us, but we also have a long way to go. Our prison population is twice what it was as recently as the late 90s, and 3 times what it was in the 80s, and that's totally consistent with what's happening nationally. Bail is a big part of that, as I'll speak to in a moment, but there are a number of reasons for that, and this campaign is designed to get at all of them in an integrated way through integrated strategies using litigation, policy advocacy, organizing, and so forth, and a lot of public education. So that's sort of the campaign for smart justice in a nutshell. And so, I just want to describe a few components of it. One, where the ACLU, so litigation is part of it. And to some extent, there will be new initiatives designed to advance the campaign goals, cutting the prison population in half. But we also have existing litigation that very much relates to those campaign goals. And one that I just want to flag is the Solow case. And I mention it because we have a case going to the Vermont Supreme Court in this year. Our briefing is due February 12th. And the Solow case arose out of a stop by a state trooper in Rutland of an African-American man who was driving, apparently with some snow obscuring his license plate, which was not illegal at the time. And so he was pulled over, and the trooper said that he smelled marijuana, which at that point had been decriminalized, and demanded to search the car. Our client refused. And so the car was impounded. Mr. Solow was forced to walk several miles on a day much like today in the dead of winter to town to retrieve his car. No contraband was found. And so he sued. And one of the issues, there are a couple of issues that will be at the Vermont Supreme Court, but one is whether the police can essentially rely on a mistake of law to justify that stop. And this is an issue that we've seen at the US Supreme Court recently. You may recall Justice Sotomayor's dissent, quoting the Black Lives Matter movement in a similar case. In recent years, we're hoping for a very different result, that the dissent in Vermont is actually the majority opinion. But that, I just wanted to flag that is an issue that I think, although it doesn't relate directly to the prison system, I mean, there's a reason why Vermont incarcerates black men at a higher rate than any other state. There are racial disparities that start from our schools, where students of color, students with disabilities, are 2 to 3 times more likely to be disciplined or suspended. We have the law enforcement data from across the state consistently showing stops of people of color, like Mr. Solow, far disproportionate to stops of white people, even though white people are found with contraband more often. And so these things are connected. So aside from litigation, we have a large policy component to this campaign. As I said, there have already been a number of important legislative initiatives underway in recent years to sort of chip away at the prison, that have had the effect of chipping away at the prison population, which is in modest decline. But there's a lot more that can be done, and there are a lot of exciting initiatives underway that I want to mention, including, critically, bail reform. We were testifying in House Judiciary Committee on Wednesday, 2 days ago, on House Bill 728, which is a bail reform bill that the Attorney General's office has had a big hand in shaping, and hoping that the Attorney General will be able to speak to it in greater detail than I'm going to. But essentially, the idea behind it, the proposition behind 728, is that people should not be incarcerated because they are poor. Okay. Roughly a quarter of Vermont's 1,700 prisoners are held pretrial. Roughly 400 people, give or take, on any given day. And a significant number of those people are there for no other reason than they cannot afford the bail amount that has been set. Not because they're a flight risk or for any other reason, just because a bail amount was set, whether it's $500 or $1,000, they're low income, they cannot pay it, and so they're in jail. And there is a growing movement around the country to end that practice. And we are hopeful that this bill will be a part of that movement. You know, for a number of reasons, and I'm going to just sort of quote from our testimony, even short stays in jail can have cascading effects on individuals, causing people to lose their homes, jobs, cars, livelihoods, and even child custody. These are pretty severe punishments for people who at this point are presumed innocent until proven guilty. People who are jailed before trial are more likely to receive a jail or prison sentence for a longer period of time than those who make bail. And due in part to the stress on one's livelihood, low-risk detainees held for more than 24 hours are more likely to commit crimes. Poor people, people of color, people with disabilities, again, are disproportionately affected by wealth-based pretrial detention. Nationwide, black people are assigned higher bail amounts than white people accused of similar offenses. Black men, for example, bail for black men averages 35% higher than bail for whites, even when controlling for the seriousness of the offense. So these are some of the reasons why bail reform is happening and why it is so critical and why this is a really timely discussion. H728, in our view, makes a number of important improvements to the system. And again, I'm hoping that the Attorney General will speak to this in some detail. But for example, it prohibits the imposition of money bail for violations of conditions of release. It's one of the most charged offenses in the state. People who, conditions are imposed to get out, and then people don't report, or they don't show up, or they don't meet those conditions, and they're back in prison. And this would prohibit the imposition of money bail to many people who can't afford it for violation of conditions. It changes the analysis from one of the factors that courts consider is the risk of non-appearance, and it changes that to risk of flight. There are a lot of reasons why people might not appear for a hearing, including childcare obligations, missing the bus, any number of things. That doesn't necessarily warrant imprisonment with all of the horrific, potentially devastating consequences that are attendant on that. So this would change the analysis to really looking, is the person actually a flight risk? If not, we're not gonna impose bail. Some of the other provisions, there's one that imposes a $200 cap on bail, and we have concerns that would still put bail out of reach for truly low-income Vermonters. We're hoping to see that amount reduced significantly. There's a provision that requires a judicial officer to take into account a defendant's ability to pay, which, while we think that's an improvement and is good, in practice might not prevent the imposition of high bails. In California, there's legislation under consideration that forbids judges from setting money bail solely because that results in pretrial detention solely based on the inability to pay. And that's, again, what really is motivating a lot of this legislation and this nationwide movement to reform our bail system. Okay, that's bail in a nutshell. A number of related issues that relate to bail. Other legislation that may be taken up soon, there's another legislator who is working on legislation to create a sentencing commission to revisit the sentencing laws. There are state's attorneys in this state who agree that the sentencing laws impose sentences that are too harsh, too long, and that it needs to be reorganized and made more fair. There are probably a dozen more bills related to criminal justice, many of them about expanding access to alternatives to incarceration, diversion, treatment, decoupling mental health and addiction from the criminal justice system. And actually, we have a list of those bills on our website. We did get a Smart Justice Vermont website up. It's on the ACLU Vermont website. And so all of those bills are on the table, but I think bail and sentencing are kind of our top priorities, at least for this session. But there's a lot more that can be done in the years ahead to continue to chip away at the number of people we incarcerate and get it down to what it was not all that long ago, less than 20 years ago. And we're, as I say, pretty confident that we can do it. Another critical piece of this campaign and that I want to touch on, it relates to bail, relates to all of this, is the role of prosecutors. And this is something that the ACLU and some other organizations have been paying increasing attention to in recent years around the country, is the role that prosecutors in Vermont, their state's attorneys, the role that they play in many cases, driving mass incarceration. A lot of people don't know that the amount of power that a prosecutor wields in determining whether somebody is sent to jail and for how long, whether they're afforded alternatives, at a time when 98% of all cases in Vermont, is my understanding, and there are probably people in the room who can confirm or correct me on that, but I believe it's about 98% of all cases result in a plea agreement, do not go to trial. And that's more or less consistent with the national average. Very few cases go to trial anymore, in part because, not always, but in part because some of the sentences that people are facing are so extreme that, or people are detained on bail amounts that they can't afford, they need to get out to get back to whatever. People accept plea deals in the vast majority of cases, and that gives prosecutors a huge amount of leverage and power and authority to determine, again, who's going to jail, for how long, why. And so, while there are, and I think in this state, there are many prosecutors who are firm believers in criminal justice reform, who want to, as I mentioned, see the sentencing laws reformed, we feel it's just really critical that people know who these public officials are and what their role in the system is, because it is such a critical piece of the criminal justice system and, in some cases, a driver of mass incarceration. How many people in the room know who the local state's attorney is? It's okay if you don't. I don't either, right? I'm not from this county, but okay, so how many people knew, before I said it, that those are elected officials. That's pretty good. Okay, so a lot of people. I've been in rooms where almost nobody knows that, and where most people don't know who their prosecutor is. And again, as a person with, an elected official with a huge amount of power in an issue area that a growing number of people across the political spectrum care about, criminal justice reform. Our polling shows that there's bipartisan, I don't know about consensus, but a bipartisan preference that the U.S. incarcerate fewer people, that it not impose racially discriminatory policies on people in the criminal justice system. There is a growing movement, and we feel really need to know the critical role that prosecutors play in this system. And so that I can pause for a second, I'm gonna ask that we have a very short video about prosecutors that's on our website, and I think it's queued up. And this will just allow you to not have to listen to me for a couple minutes while the video plays, and I'll go from there. Also allows me to check how much time I have. Do I have till 11?
Pop quiz. Who is the most powerful and influential person in the criminal justice system? It's not a judge. It's your local elected prosecutor. Here's the secret about the American criminal justice system. About 97% of cases are resolved by plea bargain. The judge has almost no role in the plea bargaining process. It's the prosecutor who decides whether you're going to go to prison and for how long. Their daily decisions with regard to who to charge, how to charge them, what prison sentence to seek has been one of the primary drivers of incarceration. So let's go back in time. Say it's 1980, you're caught for shoplifting, you're taken to court. You might be charged with a misdemeanor offense and get some community service. In 2017, the same charge might result in a felony and years in prison. How did we get here? Well, for years, prosecutors have acted with almost unchecked power. They're almost never hauled into the courtroom to answer for unaccountable practices. And the legislatures have handed prosecutors more and more power through harsh sentencing regimes, forcing people to accept plea bargains. Here's something that a lot of people don't know about district attorneys. Almost all of them are elected politicians. Prosecutors have stood in the way of criminal justice reform for decades. It's going to take a major effort to shift that tide. But guess what? We're already starting to win. In 2016, we saw a new wave of prosecutors elected to office. Prosecutors who ran on an agenda of reducing incarceration and addressing racial disparities. In cities with district attorneys who support smart justice, they emphasize rehabilitation and treatment over severe punishment. They use scarce taxpayer dollars wisely to support approaches that are more humane and more effective than incarceration. During your next district attorney election, who are you going to choose?
All right, go Taylor. So yeah, that said it better than I could have. But again, I do want to reiterate, there are parts of this country where prosecutors are really a problem. I honestly don't have the sense that Vermont is that unlucky. I've spoken with state's attorneys who are interested in drug policy reform, who are interested in sentencing reform. And so this aspect of Smart Justice Vermont is not intended to go after every prosecutor in the state and get them. It's really a public education effort. And I think many of the state's attorneys I've spoken with agree that it's important that people know what their role is and who they are and what they do. So that we can ask tough questions. And if we're not satisfied with the answers, we can hold people accountable. That's how it should work. So we have litigation, we have policy, we have a prosecutorial accountability initiative that is going to be led by our new community organizer. Another critical component of this campaign is looking at racial justice specifically. I don't think any of us would be satisfied. I know we would not be satisfied if we succeeded in cutting the prison population in half, but we did not if we left the massive racial disparities that are part of that system untouched. And that part of the effort is going to require a really multi-pronged approach. We do not feel that just focusing on racial justice in the criminal justice system alone is going to solve everything. It really, as I mentioned, these are disparities that persist from schools to police encounters. They persist in housing and healthcare. This is systemic racism in our society is reflected in the criminal justice system, and it's going to take a whole-scale approach to fighting for racial justice across all of those areas to achieve our goal. So a few things on that front that are really encouraging here in Vermont. Last year, Vermont passed the first racial justice oversight legislation in its history and established 2 oversight boards, one to look at racial disparities in the criminal justice system specifically, and another headed by the Attorney General's Office and the Human Rights Commission to look at racial disparities in all systems, housing, healthcare, education, and so forth. And the second of those 2 committees issued a report and its findings recently. The one focused on criminal justice will be issuing a report soon, and we've been working with the members of those committees to articulate recommendations. But that's an important step forward. One of the key recommendations that we made, I believe, to both committees is the need for more data. And this also relates to prosecutors and to the court system. We have Department of Corrections data that shows we have horrific racial disparities and that provides information on the makeup of the incarcerated population in the state. But for the last couple of years, Department of Corrections has not aggregated or analyzed that data. The person who used to do that, I think, retired, and they never replaced that person. So we don't have great data out of DOC. We don't have any data in an aggregated or analyzable form from prosecutors or the courts where we could say, okay, it looks like these decisions are leading to racial disparities, or it looks like this county is doing something that is off the charts as compared to other counties. So, a lot of what we know we've had to piece together from DOC, some of it anecdotal data. Data collection, we believe, is really an important piece, and there's some indication, at least some people in the legislature are interested in making data collection throughout the criminal justice system more of a priority. It's something that Connecticut and other states have done. And so anybody in the room who's interested in data and criminal justice data specifically, I would really love to speak with you about that, because that's something that we would like to have a better handle on. We're hoping the state can get a better handle on, because you can't really solve a problem if you're not looking for it. Another racial justice bill that was just introduced, and I think will be announced publicly on Tuesday, is Vermont is looking to become the second state in the nation to adopt a statewide ethnic studies curriculum for all public schools K through 12, to incorporate the voices and experiences and histories of socially non-dominant groups across the spectrum that are too often marginalized or silenced in our education system. And that is a grassroots community effort. It's now in legislation sponsored by Representative Kaya Morris and a few others. The bill's been introduced and will be announced on Tuesday. But that is something, again, that we feel absolutely relates to criminal justice reform. These are outcomes that start in many ways. They stem from many places. And so we're going to continue to make a concerted effort to advance racial justice initiatives like ethnic studies, recognizing that it is very much a component of criminal justice reform. The last thing that I would just highlight as to this campaign, and then, as I said, I don't want to talk too much longer. I'd really like to hear from you all, I have to just remark on the timing. You may have heard the governor has a proposal to build a $150 million, 925-bed private prison in Vermont. The company that was named as the likely beneficiary of that project is CoreCivic, formerly known as Corrections Corporation of America. You know, a company with a long rap sheet, let's say, a company associated with countless deaths in custody, with endless litigation around cut corners, on denial of health care, denial of basic services, and really inhumane conditions, a company that we believe profits off of human suffering. This is the proposal that was floated a few days before we announced our campaign, which we believe provides a better vision for Vermont's future, instead of lining the pockets of CoreCivic with $150 million for 925 beds that, in our view, aren't even going to be needed. We think the state is well on its way to achieving an incarceration level more like what it had in the 80s or 90s, that would make a project like that, although there are definite needs for system upgrades, for better services, that I think everybody, a lot of people recognize that, including the ACLU. This proposal to build a massive prison campus isn't the way to achieve that. So, you know, recognizing those sort of contrasting visions for criminal justice in Vermont, I would just really encourage people who care about these issues, who care about bail reform, who care about racial justice, who care about criminal justice reform, to get in touch with the ACLU, to follow the campaign. There will be opportunities to plug into you know, events, local events, looking at the role of prosecutors, or possibly public forums to discuss these issues with candidates. This is an election year. We're going to be asking questions of the candidates. There will be opportunities to support legislative initiatives like H 728 and other initiatives. You know, updates and information about all of that will be on our website, and I hope, again, if people take an interest in that you'll follow that work and let us know what you're hearing. And you know, this is going to be a long-term effort. We don't expect it will finish in 1 year. People have asked me what the timeline is, and I say as soon as possible. I hope that that is something that folks will keep an eye on for the foreseeable future. So I'm going to pause and see if folks have questions, whether it's specific to a legislative effort like the bail bill, or whether it's about the campaign, whether it's about anything having to do with the ACLU. I'm happy to do my best to answer those questions. Yes?
Hi, my name is Melody DeFlorio. We met. I'm the Director of Financial Aid here, but I also do some work with Justice for All.
Great.
And Mark Hughes. And my question is about if the ACLU has any plans or is already working on addressing the new cannabis bill that was passed, and do we have any idea of people who are currently serving time in prison because of, you know, that now that it's legal to have up to an ounce, is anyone now currently serving time because of that, and what can we do if that is the case to get them out of prison?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking it, because drug policy reform is actually another pretty core component of this campaign, nationally and in Vermont. So is there anyone in the room who knows the answer to that? I mean, there are a couple things I want to say about it. But as to that specific question, I would love to hear the answer myself.
So the answer is probably no. And the reason I say that is that Vermont had decriminalized possession of an ounce or less, and now, starting July 1, there will simply be no sanction, civil or criminal, for the same quantity. So it's hard to envision that there would be anyone serving time for that. I would just note, interestingly, that in San Francisco, they have just announced that they're going to expunge all convictions for amounts that are now legal. But I'll leave it at that.
But so the thinking is that there isn't anybody who would need an expungement in Vermont because this reform was preceded by decrim.
That I don't agree with, because Vermont does not have automatic expungement. in most instances. It's a petition process. So
Uh-huh.
there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people who have misdemeanor marijuana convictions on their record who are eligible for expungement who have not pursued that option.
Got it.
And a little plug, if I might, since I'm holding the microphone, one of the things we're hoping to do with the Center for Justice Reform at VLS is develop an expungement clinic that would help those folks clear their record.
Great, great, thank you for that. I mean, just a couple other things on marijuana legalization, and which is one piece of drug policy reform. We're also really hoping to dig into policy changes to address the opioid epidemic, and to really, there's a lot of talk about moving addiction and mental health away from the criminal justice system, but there's still a long way to go to actually make that a reality. But as to marijuana specifically, a couple of concerns we have are sort of, I guess, the pushback from legalization. There are a couple pieces. One, there is the House Transportation Committee is looking at legislation to allow for roadside saliva testing, to test people's saliva in road stops, in traffic stops, to test for the presence of THC and other drugs, and would potentially lower, one of the things it would potentially do is lower the limit for drunk drive for amount of blood alcohol level if there is also the presence of THC in the blood. And one of the many concerns we have with that bill is that THC stays in the blood a long time. The technology that it is being proposed to do this is not necessarily established as reliable, scientifically precise, maybe a little on the pseudoscientific side, although there are people who tell you that it's it's gotten a lot better. And at a time when we still have seen such drastic racial disparities in traffic stops, we do not believe a policy for roadside saliva testing would not fall under, not be enacted or implemented in the same vein. So the ACLU has a number of concerns with saliva testing that Vermont Digger has us quoted as threatening to sue, which is close. We're concerned. We were also concerned that some local towns are already looking into licensing requirements. The town of Barrie, the mayor of Barrie, and at least some city councilors appear interested in a costly and burdensome licensing system for anybody who wants to grow marijuana in their home, consistent with the new legislation. And we have some legal concerns about that as well. Those are just a couple of recent issues that are on our mind. But drug policy reform is obviously a crucial piece of criminal justice reform. Sometimes I've heard it said that the majority of offenders in America's prisons are there for nonviolent drug offenses. That's not true. But it is there are a significant number of people. The war on drugs has been waged against communities of color and resulted in just massive devastation and fueled the mass incarceration epidemic that we're now pushing back against. And so pushing back against the war on drugs is a big piece of this campaign as well. So thank you for reminding me to mention that. Are there other questions? Yes.
Thanks so much. I was so shocked to learn recently that the governor's proposal about building this huge prison and that CCA, or whatever it's called now, is actually under consideration. This company that, like Blackwater, had to change its name because it became so tainted. It's the same for CCA in Vermont.
Yep.
So where does the decision-making authority lie? Is it mostly in the governor's office, the legislature, both? I mean, which leads to what can we do about it?
Yeah. As far as I know, the governor could not unilaterally impose an $150 million contract on the people of Vermont without the legislature having any say in that. I'm I'm no legislative expert, but I'm pretty sure the legislature would require legislative approval, and I think that is unlikely. I mean, the governor will say, well, this was just a report. No one's saying it has to be a private company or it has to be this company, but we do need to do something. And we agree we need to do something, but building a 925-bed private prison or privately owned prison, which sometimes comes with minimum bed requirements. As the Attorney General said in his excellent op-ed on this topic, if you build it, you have to fill it. And that, I mean, they're not gonna build 925 beds and then realize they don't need them and they lie empty. So there's a huge amount of opposition, and there are a number of groups around the state that are coming together to coordinate a response. So there would be plenty of opportunities for people to plug into those efforts. I don't think it ever hurts to contact your local representatives and make it very clear where you stand. I mean, it's like kind of the standard thing, contact your representative, but I mean, as I think a lot of you know, in Vermont, that actually means something, means a lot. And people are doing that. People are calling the governor's office, people are calling their representatives saying, no, hell no. And so it's important that people do that, keep an ear out for other efforts to organize around this. My hope is that it's just dead on arrival, but we have to be vigilant and ensure that that's the case, because we don't feel any taxpayer dollars should be going to private prison companies of any kind for any reason, given their track record and their role in fueling mass incarceration, not in, like, nationally. So, yeah, we'll see. And we also think it's important to propose an alternative vision. Say, okay, we do need to do something, yes, but how about we cut the prison population in half and invest that in treatment, in the kind of supports and services that could actually help people and their communities, rather than lining the pockets of Core Civic or whatever they're called. So the governor's timing worked out great for us, I gotta say. If you're gonna launch a criminal justice campaign, it's good to do it a few days after a major private prison proposal has been announced. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My question is about the bail, and my understanding of the purpose of bail might not be right, so I'm here to be enlightened, not just to express an opinion. But I think that the bail is to reduce the flight risk that you talked about, and if bail is reduced to a real low limit, then flight risk becomes a problem. How do we address the flight risk at the same time? I anecdotally know a justice of the peace in New York State who had someone come before him who had done some shoplifting, and he settled a low reasonable bail limit, and then months later the same person came back for the same charge and had not attended his court date. And the judge gave him a much higher bail. And he said, well, how come you gave me a higher bail this time than you did last time? The guy said, because you didn't show up. Right. So what's the solution to flight risk on reducing bail?
Well, I mean, I think it's important, really important, to distinguish between the risk of non-appearance and flight risk. Like, they're not the same, right? And it's our view that it's one thing, and this is what the proposed legislation would do, is say if you're going to consider it, don't consider risk of non-appearance, which could be for relatively legitimate reasons. Somebody, people don't appear because of childcare obligations, because of transportation, for any, or by their own fault, potentially. But doesn't necessarily warrant setting a bail that's so high that they're now going to be in jail until trial, potentially for weeks or months, as opposed to somebody who there is on the record, it's established that this is a person with, no ties to Vermont, for example, who is for any number of reasons, there's a very legitimate risk that if we don't impose a significant bail, they're not going to show up. And so that's essentially what this reform would do, is say, flight risk is more serious than the risk of non-appearance. If somebody doesn't show up, it's not to say you can't impose more conditions of release or impose some consequence for that, but it could and should fall short of sending them to jail for the remainder of their case. Sure. Sure. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
As a former elected DA or state's attorney in Vermont, I appreciate your comments about the extraordinary power and discretion that prosecutors have. There are virtually no consequences other than maybe some bad press when a prosecutor screws up. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about what mechanism might be effective to create some skin in the game for prosecutors that would serve as a deterrent to misconduct or abuse.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and it's the question for us with this aspect of the campaign. I think the skin in the game is knowing that they can be voted out if people don't approve of what they're doing. If nobody's aware that state's attorneys are important, that they're elected, or who they are, then, there's really not, they can really do whatever they want. And you're right, like bad press might be the worst that they're gonna face. Whereas if people are engaged on criminal justice reform issues, as many in the state are, if people care about these issues, and they're asking tough questions of these elected officials, and if there are contested elections where there are people, more than one person standing for election for that office, which is sometimes an issue. And our hope is that as more and more people recognize that this is a really important office and that there is a huge amount of power, and that for people who care about criminal justice reform, running for office this is a really important office to hold. I think we can have discussions that will, put people on the record in terms of, do you support bail reform? Do you support collecting data on racial disparities? If not, why not? I think that accountability piece is really missing. And it might be that after people engage with their local state's attorney, they say, this person is great, and our values are totally in line, and I'm voting for them. But that's a question that we just really want to encourage people to ask.
Hi, James. Thank you for your
Hi.
talk.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. I think the real question for me lies when you are in the courtroom, not you, just people are in the courtroom, they before a judge or whomever, and they about to be set bail. What have you seen in your experience at the ACLU or even prior about the disparities between, if you have a black person versus a white person in front of you at different points of time in that courtroom setting? Who would get the highest bail and why? I know sometimes it's discretionary on the judge at that time and what the offense which they've been charged with. But I just want to know, in your experience, what have you noticed as ACLU representative?
So, I haven't spent, other than a brief internship at the public defender's office in San Francisco when I was in law school, I don't have a lot of direct criminal justice. Most of my courtroom experience was actually, other than civil litigation, was in deportation defense cases, which is similar, but kind of a different system. The data that I mentioned from our testimony nationwide, bail for black men averages 35% higher than bail for white men, even when controlling for the level of the offense. So there's no question that the data doesn't lie, I don't think. And I think that is sometimes just explicit racism, but I would wager that more often it is implicit bias, that pervades all of our institutions and all of these systems that is driving those outcomes. I mean, there are multiple factors, but I would say that implicit bias, systemic racism is another word for it, is driving that outcome. And again, that's one reason why data collection and analysis is so important in this state. It doesn't sound like the flashiest thing, but I always say you can't solve a problem if you're not even trying to look for it. And so we need that kind of data in Vermont, and it's going to be something that we're going to continue to push for, so that we can, having prosecutors say, yeah, actually, we are collecting data, we are going to analyze that data, and we are going to ask if our office is contributing to disproportionate incarceration of people of color in the state. We're going to look at the sentences, we're going to look at the plea deals that we're offering people and see and try and control. And I think, as I understand it, at least some states' attorneys do try to do that to some extent, but I don't know that all of them do. And again, I think it's something that we all need to become more aware of and be asking these people, is this a priority? How are you addressing it? Or are you not really answering that question? In which case, maybe I don't support you.
Thank you. And more specifically, just to Vermont, because I think it's important while we're here in Vermont Law School that we're looking at the restorative justice or the criminal justice system in Vermont. Like, what solutions, like, moving forward, should we look towards? Because I think, as you stated before, Vermont has the highest incarcerated Black men, and the population here is like probably 1%. So what is the solution? Like, what can we do just as law students or as advocates or faculty and staff who want to help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think sort of all of the things that I've mentioned, there's no one thing. I think, as an institution, as a law school, you can invite state's attorneys, for example, to come, host a candidate forum. Host a forum for all of the state's attorneys and give them, we're hoping to do a candidate survey later in the year and put it to all state's attorneys and to ask them some of these questions, sort of in writing, and then to share those results with their constituents. Not in like any kind of like gotcha way, but just what are your positions on these issues? People want to know. I think hosting a candidate forum like that at the Vermont Law School could be really powerful. So that's one thing just an idea I would float, like specific to being, a revered institution of higher learning and a bunch of legal experts. I think that would be impactful. But aside from being part of the law school, just engaging with this campaign, engaging with your elected representatives on these issues, letting them know that there's a dozen plus criminal justice reform bills in the House and Senate, some of which are not going to go anywhere because there aren't people calling and asking about them, and they're not being prioritized. There are some bills that are being prioritized, and bail reform and sentencing, as I mentioned, are two of our top priorities. But kind of engaging in the political process, and getting involved in local organizing campaigns, for example, in opposition to private prisons, making it very clear that private prisons are not welcome in Vermont. So whether it's local organizing, grassroots level, whether it's engaging with the political process and elected representatives, whether it's hosting forums to talk about these issues, bring in, there's some really good officials at the Department of Corrections who I think would probably have some really interesting insights on all of this. Have them in to talk. I think there are a lot of ways to engage it because it's a big problem and it's a big puzzle. So there have to be a lot of different strategies and ways to get at it. Thank you.
First and foremost, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I have quite a few questions. I'm going to try to tailor them down so they're understandable. So I'm actually part of the Attorney General Advisory Panel when it comes to racial disparities in the juvenile and the criminal justice system here in Vermont.
Great.
Somehow found my way up there, and I'm grateful to be there. They have me. So people like Mark Hughes are up there, Bruce as well, and Jeffrey Jones. So as we're in this meeting, we talk a lot about data collection. I was actually appointed chairman of one of the committees that deals with data collection for state police. And my question is, and something that I want to state is, for example, people of color for a very long time, we've been expressing and voicing our concern when it comes to racial disparities that we experience with state police, DCF, and Department of Corrections. And just so recently, within the last, I would say, 10, maybe 15 years, has that voice kind of picked up some steam to the point where data collection committees have popped up over the place. And now a lot of data collection is being done. The issue that I'm having with data collection is it sometimes feels like now that data collection has become somewhat of a cop-out / a slowdown of actions because you can always collect more data. And so at one point, is that data efficient enough for certain bills and legislations to start getting developed and drafted and pushed through so we can see some difference? So my question is more along the lines of, when it comes to the ACLU, strategically and planning-wise, what do you guys have planned, and what kind of strategies do you guys have set in stone? So when you feel like there's enough data that the ball can start being rolled for some of these legislations to be drafted and pushed through. Let me, get that other one that I had written down. The second thing is training, right? Police training. So the state police here in Vermont does an awesome job when it comes to training. They usually do about, so I work with Ingrid Jonas as well, so they usually do about 12 weeks prior to the required training and then additional 6 weeks after that. And a lot of that covers implicit bias, racial profiling, things of that nature. Now, that's not required. So the state police are the ones that are doing all this additional training versus the local police are only doing the required minimum training that most likely doesn't cover a lot of the issues that we just spoke about. So my question is, do you see the ACLU finding some way to expand that into legislation that's required to cover more training or certain types of training on them that do cover implicit bias and racial profiling and things of that nature on the local level? Because I know as Vermont law students, we come in contact more so with the local police rather than the state police, and that's where a lot of the issues that we run into we find. Lastly, I have a question when it comes to, you talked about setting bail and things of that nature, and from my time being on this panel, I have the opportunity of speaking with the DCF and the DOC, and what I kind of gathered from those conversations was that a lot of the people of color that come before judges, they typically tend to get pushed into locked facilities rather than going to mental health institutions when that might be the correct decision. So how do we tailor that as well? And how do we figure out, to maybe help judges or prosecutors figure out better whether it's better to put somebody in an institution to better their health, or because numbers have shown that white people have been most sent to institutions rather than people of color are most likely sent to prisons and places of locked communities.
Great. Thank you. Those are all.
Sorry for all that at
Those
once.
are all great questions. I mean, as to data and training are the first two, and those were the two recommendations I think we made to your panel. I think we said there's a lot, but to start with, not as an end point, but as a starting point, we need data and training. And your point that that's not enough to just collect the data. Okay, we've got the data, it shows racial disparities across the state, now what? Is absolutely correct. But we have to, having the data is such a critical piece of being able to make the case that reforms are needed. We were in House Transportation 2 days ago, and there was a representative who challenged the idea that there was any racial profiling happening on Vermont's roads. Like, what are you talking about? That's not true. That's not happening. Our policy director literally pulled out her computer, pulled up the report by Stephanie Seguino, like all the attendant news coverage. Let's look at this again. And really, we're still having that conversation with elected representatives, even with the data. If we don't have the data, there aren't a lot of people of color in this state. That's just, it's a low sample size. We still hear that a lot. It is really critical to have robust, strong, accurate data. And the state police have done a good job at improving their data collection over the years through a fair and partial policing process. to be able to then make the arguments, or, we really want to have data out of the courts and from the state's attorneys so that we can say, look at what is happening. You're giving people of color disproportionately long sentences. You're not sending them to alternatives. You're not giving them mental health care the way that you are to white defendants. So it just as to be able to make those arguments and to continue to put pressure on these institutions, these individuals to reform, the data is a key piece, and we have some of it, and that is, I think, what has in large part fueled some of like the racial justice legislation that was passed last year. I think a lot of it is inspired by the data showing that police across the state, not one or two bad apples, like it's a systemic problem. But it's not enough to say, okay, we've got the data. It's like, now what are we going to do with it? Well, putting in requiring anti-bias or implicit bias training would be one thing. Ethnic studies curriculum, I think, is that kind of data supports efforts like that to show that there is a real need, that people aren't just, it's not just anecdotal. It's not, well, people have different opinions and people disagree. No, the data doesn't lie, and the data is mounting, and it can't be ignored, and we can really use that as a really powerful tool to advocate for more substantive changes across all of these areas. So, but it's a point very well taken. As I say, I think training should, and that was one of our recommendations, that implicit bias training be mandatory, not just for police, not just for prosecutors, not just for judges, not just for public defenders, for everybody. And that's something we're going to continue pushing for. So yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing I would say is that helps us is hearing from people about your experiences and insights and what problems you're experiencing or seeing, or members of your community. Please contact the ACLU. If we're talking about civil rights issues, please contact the ACLU if you have questions or concerns about what's happening in your community. You're like the eyes and ears. Our members and supporters are the eyes and ears of the organization. So keep up the great work and stay in touch.
One more question, if I may.
Yeah. Keep going.
Sorry,
Keep going.
everybody. My question this one has to do with CJCs, so criminal justice centers, if you guys don't know what that is. And so I could be mistaken, but I believe right now it's a state entity. And I know when it was developed, it was supposed to be outside, like a third party, so people would feel more entitled and more supported to report any type of over excessive behavior that they felt at a police stop or with DCF or DOC. Do you know, have you heard of at some point that going back to the original idea of it being outside the state, as like a third party type of entity, so people can feel that way, or have you heard anything about it at all? Or?
I haven't. I think it's a great question. Is there anybody more familiar with CJCs than I am? Yeah, please do.
So one of the great ironies in Vermont about the community justice centers and the network is that it was largely funded through the Department of Corrections, because in the 80s and 90s, it was really DOC that provided leadership on restorative justice.
That's right.
So while some of them are funded partially by a municipality, many of them, I think maybe all of them, have significant funding through the DOC. And leave it to you to decide the politics of that. But I will say, in many respects, restorative justice came to Vermont through the leadership of DOC Commissioner John Gorsuch and people who worked with him. And that was certainly a positive development.
Yeah, and I'll admit, I'm here about a year and a half, and so I'm eager to learn more about the restorative justice system in Vermont and to see what we can do to support it and improve it and to ensure that, make it essentially so that more people are accessing restorative justice as opposed to being warehoused in prison cells. So it's a great question and something I'm hoping to have more answers to myself in the months ahead. So thank you very much. Do we have time for, how are we doing on time? We have time for a couple more questions?
you have a question?
First of all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Covered so many issues, and ones that I know the students here and faculty are very concerned about, so thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
The question I had, because you're relying a lot on, getting back to the prosecutors, people being aware of what their prosecutors are doing, and one of the concerns I have is that what we see in terms of the arrests and incarceration rates in Vermont is an expression of not really caring about that, people not connected to that issue. So if you make people aware of what the prosecutors are doing, will they be happy if they're coming down pretty hard on, we could even take race out of it, coming down hard on criminals, because that's what gets a lot of hardcore prosecutors elected. People are happy about that. I know that there's a bit of a change across the country, and that TJ Donovan is encouraging here, and there are prosecutors here. But if you're going back to the community at large, what is you mentioned you have a community organizer. What is that community organizer seeing? What do you see as the challenges in getting people to care about what's happening in terms of criminal prosecution?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. You know, we've seen kind of a sea change in people's attitudes about criminal justice in this country. And, you know, 20 years ago, we were still in the thick of the tough on crime. Nobody could afford politically to be perceived as soft on crime. And so Democrats, Republicans, everybody was just ratcheting it up further and further. And that is a big part of how we got here, is that sort of cultural, I don't know, approach to this issue. It was sort of that was just what we did. We got to get tough on crime and get tougher and tougher on crime instead of getting smarter and smarter on crime. Because we've been very tough on crime, we haven't been at all smart about it, and that's how we ended up with 2.3 million prisoners. But you know, even before we launched this campaign, there was already bipartisan movement towards criminal justice reform with some, you know, really odd bedfellows, like the Koch brothers supporting criminal justice reform. And, you know, you can be skeptical of that, but like, you know, across the political spectrum, there is more and more willingness to recognize we are putting aside just the enormous human toll. If all you care about is money, which some people, that's apparently all they care about, that is a reason to be really concerned with 2.3 million people in prison. Just in addition to the enormous societal and human cost is the financial one. So that shift is borne out in the polling that we have done. So in our press release announcing the campaign last week, and it's on our website, there are links to a couple of, I believe, or there soon will be, we're catching up to ourselves, but we've done a couple of polls, one on criminal justice reform generally, that indicate bipartisan support for smart justice approaches that do not reflect sort of a tough on crime mentality that I think a lot of us have, and that I've personally like grown up in the midst of and sort of accepted as like, well, you know, a lot of people, and it's not to say it's unanimous. There are certainly people who are like, what are you talking about? Why would you ever let anybody out of prison for any reason? They're, you know, a bunch of killers. But a surprising number of people, and again, it tests people across the political spectrum, support smarter approaches to criminal justice. We also did a poll about prosecutors specifically, where a large percentage of people said that they're more likely to support prosecutors who enact criminal justice reforms, who care about racial justice in the criminal justice system and addressing racial disparities. And there's a couple of really interesting polls, and we're actually hoping to do some Vermont-specific polling around similar questions that I have every reason to believe will show similar results. So, I mean, I think there's reason to be optimistic that, and that's a big piece of this campaign, is like the public education aspect. When people begin to understand how powerful prosecutors are, or how bad things have gotten, or how wasteful the system is, a lot of people are, you know, not so quick to say, you know, somebody who commits a crime should just be locked up and the key should be thrown away and that's it. And so our hope is to continue that momentum going and to see, you know, as Vermont's prison population has declined, something that TJ says rightfully all the time is that as the prison population has started to decline, public safety has improved. So, I mean, the argument that to have a safe community, you need to be tough on crime is actually not borne out by the recent experience in Vermont. And we think as we continue to downsize our prison population, it will continue to be borne out, and there will be more support for what are essentially common sense. We're not proposing a completely reckless or, out of left field approach to criminal. We're just essentially saying we need to be smarter about this. So thank you for asking.
I think this will be our final question.
Thank you for coming. I really have enjoyed listening to
Thank you.
everything you've been talking about. So my experience with working on this issue has been mostly with migrant farm workers. And I guess it's more of a concern than a question is how do you deal with the number one, lack of will in some local departments, not all, but some, to embrace any training on these issues. And then number two is the difficulty with especially local law enforcement closer to the Canada border, where you see a lot more interaction with Border Patrol. And in fact, a reliance on Border Patrol to assist. So that becomes a little more muddy.
Yeah. As to the first one, there's always, I think there's always going to be some in law enforcement who are going to resist just about any reform, or at least many reforms. And it's not an easy thing to get 100% buy-in on any of this stuff, but I think Vermont is really lucky to have some very good leaders, at all levels. Not across the board, not 100%, but there's some really great leadership in the state that, coming from Arizona, I can say, Vermont has a long way to go in a lot of ways, but we do have, I would say, better leadership in many of these areas than some other states, at least some other states. As to, Border Patrol collaboration, that's something that I worked at pretty much almost full time for several years when I was in Tucson. Yeah, I was with the ACLU in Tucson for a few years, focused on Border Patrol abuse specifically. And in my experience, almost any time local law enforcement gets involved with Border Patrol, any individual stop, there's very likely going to be a constitutional rights violation. Someone's going to be held without authority, Fourth Amendment violation. They're going to be stopped as a matter of racial profiling. Not in every case, but in a whole lot of cases, when local cops try to get entangled in immigration and act as immigration officers, which they don't have authority to do, there are problems. And so we are always looking for stories of that happening. We talked about being our eyes and ears. Like, if you hear anything, please let us know, because that is a big concern, and it's one of the reasons why we advocate very strongly that local cops just don't do something that is not your job. I just thought also of something. The last thing I want to say, one other component of this campaign that we think is really important, is to lift up the experiences and insights of people who are directly impacted by the criminal justice system. So people who are formerly incarcerated, family members of people who are incarcerated. We really want to have those people at the forefront of this campaign, because these are people who know what the problems are and know what the solutions are as well or better than anybody else. So that we're also going to be reaching out and asking people with direct or indirect experience with the criminal justice system to contact us to help us see this campaign through. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Let's give James one more a round of applause. Well, today's forum is about bail. I think the most important thing that we should start off by saying, what is bail? Like, for us, or for those who do not know what bail is, I'm gonna simplify it for you. So what bail is a contract agreement between the court and the accused to come before the trial. This agreement can include a phone call reminder from the court or people being released on their own accord. But most cities, counties, states, and the federal government currently require money bail. So up next, we have a film to show you all. It's a 30-minute film, but I believe you all will get a lot from it. It's more of an educational film, and then afterwards, we're gonna have a Q&A moderated by, the moderator will be Lucky Malad. She is our CNNE Regional Board member for NEBASA and also a local chapter member. So I'm gonna give you a little background about the film that you all is about to watch. So money bail is the main features of mass incarcerations, as James just mentioned not too long ago. Yet most Americans know very little about it. And this film that we all about to watch is produced by Brave New Films. It's called The Bail Trap, American Ransom. The money bail system is broken. Private companies make extreme profits by scavenging off of communities, primarily people of color, living in poverty. Low-income Americans sit in jails for days, months, and even years for minor infractions, simply because they cannot afford to pay the high bail amounts. The reality is that 70% of Americans are in jail for one simple reason: being too poor. So I want you all to watch this video and think about questions that you all might have, because this will inform our discussion about bail reform and what can we do as a community, as a VLS community, as a Vermont community, and change the system. So without further ado, we're about to turn to the video. Thank you so much.